I've been checking the COVID-19 stats every day, for Los Angeles anyway. 16,000 known infected, 729 dead. Mortality rate has leveled off to 4.2 or so. Case derivative is flat, so we're increasing, of course, but not accelerating. I'm not exactly sure what happens next. There's no data on this. I don't know what my prior is. It's probably a good time to simulate, certainly to debate, maybe just to wait, or the other wait, the evidence. But traditional tabular data science isn't going to get us so far here. We need to model some of this stuff, and this form of modeling is not something we often cover on the show per se. When I say model, I almost always mean fit and predict. That wouldn't satisfy a physicist, and it apparently shouldn't satisfy an epidemiologist either. Nor, I guess, an economist. I've gotten a lot of wisdom from economists over the years. If I had to sum it all up, I guess I might say, be careful what you wish for. This week on the show, I speak with Becca Taylor, economist from the University of Sydney. Although we're going to be talking about a data set from right here in my home state of California. What exactly are the effects of disposable carryout bag regulations? Well, Rebecca's going to help us interpret the evidence. Today's episode is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus at thegreatcoursesplus.com/data.
Hello, I'm Dr. Becca Taylor. I'm a lecturer in economics at the University of Sydney.
Could you talk a little bit about your specific interest areas within economics?
I study consumer behavior, food policy, as well as environmental regulations. Those are my main areas in economics.
Just broadly speaking, could you maybe characterize your role? How much of it is mathematics and statistics? How much of it is, empirical and data gathering? What's the day-to-day like?
My research is empirical, so it's very data-driven. So a lot of my day-to-day is looking for data sources to answer economic questions that I have. The other part of the day is analyzing that data and interpreting the results. So data is quite important in my day-to-day in my research.
And I'm going to ask a fairly naive question, but I'd love to know how policy fits into that. Are you hoping to influence law, or what does it mean to be policy-focused?
The research questions that I've always found the most interesting are those that are policy relevant. So a lot of the work that I've done has come out of policy debates, especially around food regulation and environmental regulation. So often what real world policy events are what spur me to think about research questions, in which case I start looking for data to answer these questions.
I'm sure we're going to frame a lot of that in the context of the specific paper I invited you on to discuss today. Title of that being Bag Leakage, the Effect of Disposable Carryout Bags. Could you frame a little bit of the problem or the controversy or the policies in general? What is it about plastic bags that's interesting to an economist?
So I was already working on plastic bag regulations. I was interested in the design of plastic bag regulations when a friend who works for a company that produces garbage bags mentioned to me that the California plastic bag bans were impacting sales of garbage bags. In particular, they were increasing. And so this triggered to me this economic concept of leakage. When a regulation only affects one particular product or industry or area, there's a potential for leakage, for demand or production to shift into an unregulated part of the economy. So in this case, the banning of the thin plastic grocery bags at supermarkets was leading to a substitution towards buying more unregulated garbage bags. And I don't think this is necessarily a surprising finding. A lot of people, when I talk to them, say, yes, oh yes, I reuse my grocery bags as garbage bags. However, I couldn't find anyone who had actually measured how much people were reusing these bags, in part because the reuse of a product in the home is not always observable to researchers, to policymakers. And even when you ask individuals, how many bags do you get from the grocery store and how many do you reuse in your house, you're going to get sort of fuzzy answers. I asked this to myself and I couldn't even come up with a clear picture of my own behavior. So when we think about surveying people, they might not necessarily know. So I wanted to think about how I could actually measure the amount of bags that people were using and how many of these bags were being reused as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, bags are so fungible, and I have lots of use cases for them. And, we even in gardening, I might be like, oh, let me just put a bunch of crap in here for a while and then, dump it later, stuff like that. They're kind of multi-purpose. I would have a hard time answering that. What sort of data set can you get that might be closer to ground truth?
Right. For the use of plastic bags, especially at supermarkets, this data was not readily available. This data needed to be collected. And so I was actually working on collecting some of this data for a different project. And so I thought to continue the collection in order to look at this leakage question. And so what it involved was going to supermarkets and observing people and seeing the types of bags that they use at checkout. This was the main way that we could understand what people were actually doing in terms of the bags that they were using: paper bags, plastic bags, reusable bags. For how people reuse the bag, that was a little bit trickier until the policies occurred themselves. So when the bans occurred and people no longer had access to these free, or quote unquote free, garbage bags, then we could look at sales of garbage bags. So there are data sets that exist that show you all the products that are sold within a store over time. And so that's where we could get data on trash bag sales.
So that data set, where does that come from and who collects it?
So the first data set, myself and a team of undergraduate researchers visited stores before and after bag bans went into effect in California. We visited supermarkets and we stood at registers and we, with clipboards, and we tallied what customers did. So it was a very manual way of collecting data. The other set of data, the scanner data that I mentioned, the sales data on trash bags, and those are collected by supermarkets and then companies that collect data from supermarkets, what they sell, how much they sell these items for. They collect them together and they provide them to researchers in order to understand consumer behavior.
In your own data collection process, I'm curious, what sort of categories did you see when the bag bans went in? Or like, what are the options for people to use?
So for the types of bags that people use at supermarkets, there's the traditional thin plastic grocery bag. It's under 2.25 mils thick, so it's quite thin. There's paper bags, which may or may not have handles. There's slightly thicker plastic bags, which are above the 2.25 milli-inches thick. And then there's a variety of reusable bags made out of PET or cloth, as well as some other, some people brought, especially after the bag bans went into effect, people brought suitcases. I didn't see any wheelbarrows personally, but I have seen news reports that people, were quite creative in the types of carrying devices that they brought to stores.
And so these bag bans, then, are these what an economist might call a natural experiment?
Yes, or a quasi experiment, especially in California. So, waste regulation in the US is generally done at the local government level. So, in California, over a span of 9 years, local governments across the state began implementing these plastic bag bans. And so, we call this a natural experiment or a quasi experiment because it's not like a policymaker randomly said this city will have a policy and this city won't. Instead, we're using this variation that occurred somewhat naturally over time with different cities and different counties implementing policies. This will allow us to create the counterfactual, comparing policies or comparing cities that have already adopted a policy to cities who haven't yet adopted a policy. The thing to note about California in particular is that they eventually implement a statewide policy. So this local level policy adoption eventually affected everyone in the state.
What were you able to learn from that data set and looking at the times the bans went into effect?
So, starting with the garbage bag sales data, what I found was that sales of garbage bags increased very quickly after the plastic bag bans went into effect. And in particular, for smaller garbage bags. So, for garbage bags that are quite similar in size to traditional grocery bags, those bags saw a 120% increase in their sales immediately after the policies went into effect. And this increase in sales was persistent over the sample period of data that I had. So, 2 years after the policy and more, the increase in sales persisted. But it wasn't just small garbage bags that increased. I also saw increases in medium and large garbage bags as well. And it should be noted that the medium and large garbage bags, while they increased by around 60 and 5%, these bags are much thicker. They contain a lot more material. And so the amount of plastic that's used in them is actually substantially greater than the smaller trash bags. The types of bags people use at checkout, there we found that the policies had the intended effect of reducing the amount of thin traditional carryout bags. They also led to an increase in paper bag use as well as an increase in reusable bag use.
That's an interesting point, and I think you've maybe chosen your words very carefully. Depending on how you want to frame it, one could say, maybe a politician might say, it was a success. If the goal is to reduce the thin plastic bag usage, that did indeed happen. But there are these external consequences of that weren't necessarily spoken to from the policy. Is that a fair framing, or how do you look at it?
Yes, exactly. The elimination of the thin plastic bags was successful. However, it was offset by an increase in plastic trash bag sales. And when we convert that into the total amount of plastic, I find that about 30% of the plastic that was eliminated comes back in the form of these thicker trash bags. It would be fair to say that if we only looked at the bags that were used at checkout, we would be overstating the benefits of the policy.
Interesting. Yeah. So I like that you look at total plastic usage because presumably you eliminate one version of it, it transfers or may transfer amongst the others. Is that the complete picture, or do you worry that it could have transferred into other mediums or something like that? I've never seen an aluminum bag, but are there other options?
Yes, this research very much relates to other studies, life cycle assessment studies that look at not just plastic bags, but they compare plastic bags and paper bags and reusable bags to try to understand the environmental impact of these bags. And so this paper in particular is focusing on plastic, but when we compare plastic bags to other types of bags, a concern is that plastic bags, especially when they're reused as a garbage bag, perform much better than paper and reusable bags in terms of their carbon footprint. However, they don't do so well on other dimensions such as litter. And so I think it is important for policymakers to think about what are the substitutes for the products that are banned, not just in terms of the substitutes within the store, other types of carryout bags, but also substitutes that maybe weren't as obvious when designing the policy, such as garbage bags and other uses for bags. I used to use them to store my gym shoes to keep it separate from my other stuff. So there's other uses for plastic bags than just as carrying groceries. They're used as garbage bags. They're used to throw away diapers, to clean up after your pet. And so in some ways, what I'm estimating here is really a lower bound for the potential leakage of plastic into other areas of the economy.
Yeah, and for the most part, do you think that the leakage went into other plastic projects or products, I guess I should say? Or has the leakage predominantly gone into other areas? How do you follow it through, I guess?
With my data, the main product I'm seeing it spill into is the garbage bags and wrapping material. I'm not seeing evidence that other products had large increases. But again, the products that I can see are those that are sold within the supermarket. So I don't necessarily see products that are sold outside of the supermarket or that are still potentially given for free, like the produce bags, the smaller bags that you can put your apples, and potentially those are also used more. And so this data can capture some of the leakage, but not all of the leakage.
You'd mentioned observing an increase in all the sizes you study, the small, medium, and tall trash bags. The small in particular being 120%. That's doubling plus 20%, right? That's a pretty big increase. Or how would you frame it, I guess?
I would agree that it's a large increase in the use of these smaller bags in particular. When you convert it into the number of bags, which I have in the paper, so in percent terms, it's quite large. They weren't the most popular bag type before. So the tall kitchen bag would have been higher sale item before. However, because it's such a higher sale item, even a 5% increase in its sales is quite large. And so I also look at the number of bags and not just the increase in the percent of bags as well. And so that definitely goes into the calculation.
Well, I'd like to ask you what's probably the hardest question is, were these policies effective? But I presume the answer is it depends. So what does it depend on? How do we decide if something was successful or not, or the degree to which it succeeded or failed?
When we think of plastic bags and what were the market failures, as economists like to say, before they were regulated, the first problem is that they appeared to be free. People didn't see the price of the amount of plastic grocery bags they used, and so they were using more than they would have if they had faced that price. The second issue with the thin plastic bags is that they're thin and lightweight, and they easily blow out of people's possession into the environment where they cause this large litter problem. And so policies that can address both of these market failures, the fact that they appear to be free and that they're lightweight, those are two of the policy objectives. And so I think policies that think about making sure that the price of all bags is transparent, the remaining bags, especially, not just the bags that are regulated, but paper and reusable bags, I think that's going to be a successful policy. So I generally would recommend a minimum price for all bags that are provided at supermarkets. But I would say that the California policies still address these concerns around they're regulating that bags can't be too thin, which means they're going to be less likely to blow away. And they're also implementing a price for paper and reusable bags of 10 cents. That was something I hadn't mentioned before, but that's another part of the policy. However, when we think about what are the benefits, that's where it gets a little bit trickier. And so I would say that we probably were overestimating the benefits before and not including sales of garbage bags. I think the trick here is that we have one environmental problem, which is litter, plastic making it into oceans. But we have this other environmental problem, which is carbon footprint. And we have a good understanding of how plastic production contributes to carbon footprint. And we have a less strong understanding of sort of the downstream implications. And so we're balancing these two policy objectives. And that's what makes it tricky to make a definitive answer on the success of these policies.
Thanks to this week's sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. It's been an excellent resource for shelter in place. If you're looking to do more than just binge watch some show or some random video, then it's time for you to look at the selection of lectures available on the Great Courses Plus. This week I'd like to recommend you check out The Science of Mindfulness, a research-based path to well-being. There's a lot of woo and hocus pocus in psychology and well-being and things like that. As in all things, follow the scientific method. And The Science of Mindfulness is a great place to get started doing just that. Harvard psychologist Dr. Ronald Spiegel shares mindfulness techniques which neurobiologists have studied, which neurobiologists have proven to affect our brains. That's just one of the many great courses available. The Great Courses Plus provides an opportunity to learn, grow, and decompress. With an extensive library of topics to help us through these uncertain times, put your mind at ease. Or take this as an opportunity. Maybe now's the time to learn to speak a new language, play an instrument, or just improve your cooking skills. And with the Great Courses Plus, these courses are going to seamlessly work across your phone, tablet, or internet-connected TV. And now is the perfect time to start. The Great Courses Plus is giving my listeners this excellent offer: a free trial of unlimited access to their entire library. Guys, that's no joke. You owe it to yourself to check this out. Start your free trial at thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. Remember, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. So there's a couple of, I'm not an economist, at least to the degree you are, but I'm sort of tangential and familiar with some of the key ideas. So a number of things come to mind. One is like the notion of nudge from, the classic book, and maybe not having them available. As you said, that when the bags were free, people just took them and maybe didn't have as much concern for the downstream effects. Having even a nominal cost could be the secret to this. Or maybe we do need a sweeping ban, and that's the way to be effective. Because from the other angle, all you've kind of done is inconvenience the customers, right? Instead of giving them the bag at the point of sale, you're forcing them to go to the aisle that has those bags or the equivalent and purchase them from there. What are some of the methodological ways that economists look at issues like this?
So I guess first to address the nudge issue, I'm sort of hesitant to call these types of regulations nudges, in part because if you have a bag ban, that's a strict policy. To me, it goes beyond what a nudge is. In some ways, it can be seen as a product standard. So we're saying, similar to how we say cars have to have a certain fuel efficiency, governments are saying bags have to meet certain requirements. One of those is that they are thick enough, that they're reusable, that they are strong enough. You could compare this bag ban more to a product standard, in my view, than to a nudge, in part because I do think it is a much stricter policy than a nudge. Similarly, if we change the price of bags or we require bags to have a price that's transparent to customers, then we're really looking at market forces, elasticity of demand. And so again, I view that as a little bit stronger than a nudge. To me, a nudge doesn't change the price or the choice set, but I would say that this is something that is debated. I've heard people call the small fees a nudge. I generally disagree and think of them as being a market-based policy or a command and control policy.
Are you familiar with the arguments that the plastic bag, that maybe we're looking at this in too myopic of a point of view, that the plastic bag's the enemy, but perhaps, whether you adopt this perspective or not, that bag gets used and reused in ways that aren't well documented, these home cases lining litter boxes and whatnot, and that maybe we're having a negative externality by blocking all those other things, and we could end up in a worse case than where people hoped we might get. I guess, what are your general thoughts on the cautionary tale here?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful on what we tell the public is single use and what we tell the public isn't single use. Plastic bags were used and, as my research shows, were reused in particular as garbage bags and bin liners. And so there is a bit of a worry if we're saying that these bags can only be used once, that's what people start to do. And so if we could instead frame it as the more you can reuse any item, especially items that are thinner, the better it is going to be for the environment. And we can go back to our 3 R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle. There has been a lot of focus on recycle, in the last 20 years, 30 years, but a renewed focus on both reduce and reuse is important. Encouraging all items to be seen as potentially reusable can have great impacts. And so I do worry that there was a group of people who were doing this very green thing. They were reusing their grocery bags as garbage bags. And this prevented the production of more garbage bags. By banning the grocery bags, you're prohibiting these people from doing this green behavior. So what I find is about 12 to 22%, depending on how you measure reuse, 12 to 20% of these plastic bags were being reused as garbage bags. And so those bags can no longer be reused. So I do think it's important to recognize that there were some people who were acting in a very green way, and now they can no longer do that.
If you had the opportunity to sit down with a policymaker, I don't know if that's the governor or some mayor or something like that, and they said, hey, this bag ban issue's coming up in my city or town or whatever, what are the most informative things you can tell them to help them make a good decision for their constituents?
Right. My biggest concern are policies that implement a bag ban without considering substitute. I want to plug some research from a colleague of mine, Tatiana Hominoff, who her and her co-authors studied policies in Chicago. Chicago first had a plastic bag ban, which didn't require a fee or a tax for any substitutes. So paper and reusable bags were left unregulated. And they found that retailers started providing thicker plastic bags for free. So it had this very large unintended consequence. Chicago later repealed the bag ban and implemented a bag tax instead. And I think this research shows that if we have a bag ban without thinking about substitutes and the price of substitutes, we can have potentially very large unintended consequences. And so there's definitely, in my mind, there's sort of a ranking of policy tools that could be used. I would encourage considering a bag fee or bag tax for all types of reusable bags or reusable and disposable bags that are offered, that they should have a minimum price. There's reasons to have it as a tax versus a fee, which I could get into, but those are sort of tangential policy discussions. For those that consider a bag ban, I would recommend they look to the California policy, which set a ban on plastic bags under a certain thickness, and then also required that other types of bags, paper bags and reusable bags, be sold for at least 10 cents. So it didn't leave the close substitutes unregulated. There still were unintended consequences, as we see that garbage bag sales did increase, but it doesn't have as large of unintended consequences as if you had just banned the plastic bags and hadn't thought about paper and reusable bags.
I think those are some great resources. We'll try and get some of those in the show notes. I'd love to follow up on that point you made about tax versus fee. I don't remember who originally pointed this out to me. It has always stuck with me when someone said there's 2 reasons for a tax, and correct me if you think this oversimplifies, but the government needs money to run, so there's taxes for that, but the government would also like to disincentivize bad behavior, put a tax on things we don't want you to do. Is that the characterization you were looking for, and how does it fit in with the plastic bag bans in particular?
There's a bit of issue also with taxes versus fees. Some states do not allow local governments to implement taxes without state approval. And so, for instance, in DC, there is a tax on paper and plastic bags. Part of that tax goes to the government, as you said, to fund projects to clean up plastic from rivers. Some of that tax is actually kept by the store to help them cover their costs. In California, a tax wasn't available because of a law that said that bags could not be taxed. So instead, they use a fee, or you can think of this as a price floor. So instead of being collected by the government, the fee goes entirely to the supermarket. I think another interesting consideration is public support for fees over taxes. When consumers know that the money is going to go to help the environment, they might behave slightly different than if they think the money is just going to the supermarket. And so I think there's some interesting considerations. Some of them are legal, whether or not your local government can even implement a tax. But if there is the option, there's some other behavioral differences potentially could occur as well.
And I'm curious, are there any analogs to other types of bans we might want to compare against? I know there's been some bans on, or maybe rebates for hybrid cars are an example, or taxes on cigarettes and smoking and stuff like that. Is there something that's sort of apples to apples that we can talk about and compare and contrast how a bag ban is the same or different?
I think one thing that there hasn't been as much research done on bans versus taxes when it comes to consumer behavior. There was a study that I know of done looking at smoking bans in public places, so banning people from smoking in places where they can expose other people versus taxes on cigarettes. And those also found that smoking bans have unintended consequences in that they shift smokers into areas where they actually might expose younger individuals, in particular children, more to secondhand smoke. So I think that's sort of an example where a ban might have an unintended consequence where a tax might not have the same degree. The paper by Tatiana Hominoff that I mentioned also compares, and it's a very nice setting because it's in the same city with two different policies looking at a bag ban versus a bag tax, and again finds that these unintended consequences were much larger with the bag ban than the bag tax. A lot of the studies that have been done were more looking at on the production side, looking at industries and more so than looking at consumers. So I do think there is a rich literature when we think about taxing versus banning industries around pollution. But yeah, I think the literature is a little bit more to my knowledge.
And one factor we haven't really touched too much on is marine debris. Could you comment a bit, maybe some of the high levels on how much of this plastic is ending up in our oceans, perhaps how bad that is, and if the bans have helped it?
The big issue when we think about plastic waste is that it can end up as litter. Estimates have found that between 2 and 5% of plastic in coastal jurisdictions is mismanaged and makes it into the ocean. So one of the big costs, the potential worries of plastic waste, is that it can have these very disastrous impacts on sea life, marine animals. And I think this is a very active area of research to try to understand what are the costs of this growing amount of plastic that we're seeing in the oceans. Where exactly is it coming from? What policies can be done to think about? And thinking very globally about it, some studies have shown that a lot of the plastic that's making its way into oceans is coming from 4 rivers in Asia. And so understanding global trade and waste and how that might be impacting how plastic is making it into oceans and waterways is a very interesting area of research. One thing we can say is that we have a better understanding of how upstream the production of plastic impacts carbon footprint, but understanding the costs of plastic once it makes it into the environment, into oceans and waterways. That was a figure that I had a harder time finding in the literature, how to quantify that cost. And so I do think that's an active area of research that we're going to see in the next couple of years.
Having done all this research, I guess at some level, maybe it's political, but do you take a position on what we as a society should be doing here?
Yes. So I do believe that we have a problem with overuse of plastic items. And as I mentioned before, there's both the fact that when something seems like it's free, people use more than they would if they had to pay for it. So I do think there is a concern about the overuse of plastic grocery bags because they seemed like they were free. And this is true for other products as well. When we think about if you go to a restaurant, takeaway, the cutlery that you use, the bags that you might get there, the straws, all of those items they appear to be free, but really you're paying for them in the overall price of your food. So you might not take those into consideration when you make the purchase. And so I think it's important that we do think about the overuse. At the same time, it's important to also think about the benefits of these products, especially in that they can have second lives. And I find it interesting that in this time, where we have a global pandemic, that a lot of the policies to encourage reusable items have been temporarily suspended. So a lot of takeaway restaurants are no longer allowing people to bring their reusable items because of concerns about food safety. And so another benefit that we do need to think about, that plastic has some important costs, and we do want to be careful about overuse, but we also want to be aware of the benefits of plastic and that it can be used to throw away waste that might contaminate other things, that because it is thin, going to have a lower carbon footprint than other items. So there are these benefits. And so what I think is important for policymakers to consider is that there are going to be these competing policy objectives. And can we think of regulations that are going to be able to address public health? If we think about packaging on food, a lot of the packaging on food is to keep it fresh and free of contaminants. So if we completely eliminate that, we might be worried about increased spread of foodborne illness. And I think that's particularly relevant today, but also the environmental impacts. And so finding that balance is very important. And to find that balance, it's helpful to have data on what people are doing. And so I think that's where this paper comes in, to say, here is some data on what consumers were doing with their plastic items, and so that policymakers can calibrate the costs and the benefits of these policies better.
And then to follow up, for listeners who might fall into the category of, let's say, either slacktivist or activist, obviously I think adopting some smart choices in what you use for carryout bags is part of that. Do you have any thoughts on where the biggest impacts lie? What's the low-hanging fruit for people who want to, quote-unquote, do the right thing?
I honestly think it can be very individual in what the low-hanging fruit is for people. I think there's the 3 Rs again, the reduce, reuse, and recycle. If there's something that you can reduce that you don't need, then try not to use it. If there's something that you can reuse in a creative way, that's great. And then for everything else, consider recycling. And so I don't think that the solution is going to be the same for everyone. And I think there also might be, even within an individual, there might be a variety of things that can be done using reusable bags for many products, but potentially getting a couple plastic bags to use as bin liners, maybe paper bags to use for recycling. I think that the less that can be used, the better, the more that can be reused, and then recycling is sort of our last resort.
Yeah, good advice. You had mentioned something I wanted to get back to, and that's the sustainability of the results. Maybe a devil's advocate might say, oh, your results stockpile just went up. When the bags went in, people panicked. So for the next month, they just bought a bunch and then everything leveled out. What does the data actually tell us?
Yeah, it's something that was surprised me a little bit, was how persistent the results are, how persistent the increase in buying more trash bags is. It persists over an entire sample period that I have. People begin buying more trash bags and then they continue to have to buy these trash bags. And so this is an example of a policy that has these very persistent effects on what people are doing. And I think this is interesting because other policies that are a little bit less sort of strict, they're not necessarily banning a product, we often see more temporary effects. So we might not imagine that this would last as long. Educational campaigns where we educate people about, they sometimes have initial effects, but then there's a little bit of a rebound. Here, it is remarkably persistent how people change their behavior and then stick with that new behavior after the policy change.
Very interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Becca, this has been really interesting. Where can people follow you online and keep up with your work?
Yes, you can follow me on Twitter at Becca Taylor Econ. I also post my research online at rebeccataylor.site.
Excellent. We'll have links to both of those in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for coming on to share your research and your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, I'm George.
Hi, I'm Lan, and we wanted to tell you about our new show with Kyle from Data Skeptic called Data Skeptic Journal Club.
So Journal Club is a panel show where we discuss various news articles, academic papers, and blog posts. In our episode this week, I've written a blog post about Scott Lundberg's SHAP library. I've used an interpretability method that he devised and then programmed, and I use it to do a bit of exploratory data analysis.
In this episode, I talked about a paper titled Adversarial Examples Are Not Bugs, They Are Features. So this paper basically asked the question why our state-of-the-art classification model is so brittle and so easy to fool, but from a different perspective. So rather than saying this is a property only of the model or of the training procedure, they propose that these adversarial examples are due to non-robust features in the dataset. And Kyle talked about AlphaFold, which is a framework from DeepMind to predict protein folding based on their genetic sequences.
We release new episodes every Wednesday, and we'd love for you to come and join in our discussion.
Thanks for listening to Data Skeptic Interpretability. If you're looking for something to do next, head over to thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. Claudia Armbruster is our associate producer. Vanessa Bursiaga does guest coordination. I've been your host, Kyle Polich. Stay in, stay safe, and learn a little data science while you're at it.